The sand isn't sand anymore. It's a slurry of coral, smoke, and blood, thick enough that every step drags like wet cement. A Marine drops flat as a burst of machine gun fire rips over his helmet, splintering the wooden seawall inches from his face. The air tastes like burned cordite and salt. The tide keeps rising, pushing bodies back toward the reef. Someone is shouting for a medic, but the surf swallows the words. He looks up and sees it, the stretch of open ground he has to cross. 40 yards of nothing. No cover, no pause. Just the certainty that the next sprint might be his last. How do you keep moving forward when the ocean behind you is turning red and there's nowhere left to go? Here's the thing about Tarawa. Nothing about it should have taken 3 days. A single square mile of coral, barely above sea level, guarded by fewer than 5,000 Japanese defenders. On paper, it looked simple. In reality, it became one of the most violent, claustrophobic tests the Marines ever faced. This story isn't about strategy on a map. It's about what happens when planning meets a reef that won't let the landing craft through. When the tide betrays the timetable. When a man steps off the boat knowing he has to cross open water under machine gun fire just to touch land. It's a story of a Marine who survived 72 hours that felt like a lifetime. Someone who learned, minute by minute, what it costs to take a fortified island that the enemy swore would never fall. By the time we reach the decisive moment, you'll see why this tiny patch of coral reshaped how America fought across the Pacific. Tarawa wasn't chosen because it was big. It was chosen because it was dangerous to ignore. Sitting in the middle of the Central Pacific, Betio, the main island of the atoll, was a flat sliver of coral bristling with guns, bunkers, and interlocking fields of fire. From the air, it looked small and almost harmless. Up close, it was a fortress shaped like a knife. For the Americans, the path to Japan ran through the Central Pacific, and Tarawa was the doorway. If they couldn't take this island quickly, the entire island-hopping strategy risked slowing to a crawl. Every supply line, every timetable, every next move depended on getting this right. But right was already slipping away. The geography alone was a warning. The lagoon was shallow, unpredictable, and, critically, rested on a coral reef that no one fully understood. The Japanese commander, Admiral Shibasaki, had fortified every inch of Betio with trenches, machine gun nests, 8-inch naval guns embedded in concrete, and a defensive belt that could cut into advancing Marines like a saw blade. His men were well dug in, well supplied, and prepared to fight to the death. On the American side, the 2nd Marine Division carried confidence anchored in experience, but also fatigue. They had fought hard in earlier campaigns. They knew amphibious assaults were a gamble. Still, they expected the naval bombardment to do most of the work. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers lined up offshore, ready to pulverize the island into submission. The assumption was simple: hit the island hard enough and resistance would crumble. But assumptions in war are like paper roofs in a storm. Intelligence reports came in uneven, rushed, sometimes contradictory. Some said the tide would be high enough for landing craft to glide over the reef. Others hinted it wouldn't. Marine officers debated it until the last minute, but the plan moved forward anyway. Here's where the first miscalculation formed. The amphibious tractors, the LVTs, could crawl over the reef, but there weren't enough for every wave of Marines. Higgins boats, which carried the bulk of the assault force, needed deeper water. If the tide stayed low, those boats would stick, forcing Marines to wade hundreds of yards under direct fire. Everyone hoped the tide would rise. No one had a guarantee. And in the background, across the intelligence rooms back in Hawaii, Tuesday's intelligence, the warnings about Japanese fortifications and rising complexity of Pacific defenses were piling up. Tarawa wasn't just another island, it was proof of what was coming. And later, in the factories we see on Friday, America's answer would take shape in steel, engines, and production lines built to overcome exactly this kind of nightmare. The Marines didn't know that yet. They only knew they were heading toward a reef, a fortress, and an enemy who believed no American would ever set foot alive on Betio. The board was set. The clock was moving. The tide, quite literally, was the question. Dawn breaks with a false sense of order. Battleships fire in slow, deliberate rhythm, each shell a rolling thunderclap that shoves the air outward in hot waves. Columns of black smoke rise from Betio, curling into the sky like torn fabric. From a distance, it looks decisive. From the decks of the transports, it looks like victory already taking shape. But inside the LVTs, the feeling is different. Marines crouch shoulder to shoulder, water sloshing around their boots. Engines growl. The salt spray stings their eyes. Ahead, the island seems close enough to touch, but the reef is closer. Then the naval guns stop. A sudden quiet settles over the lagoon, wide, eerie, unnatural. The kind of silence that makes a man hear his own heartbeat inside his helmet. The first wave moves. LVTs churn forward, their steel tracks clawing water into froth. The Marines inside grip their rifles, waiting for the return fire everyone expects. For a few long seconds, nothing happens. And then the Japanese guns come alive. Machine guns stitched into the seawall unleash a flat, unbroken roar. Concrete pillboxes flash with muzzle bursts every few seconds. Mortar rounds begin dropping around the LVTs, kicking up water plumes that tower over them. Halfway to the beach, the first LVT disappears into an explosion. Another takes a direct hit and burns instantly, flames licking across the water's surface. Marines jump, swim, fight to stay afloat with packs dragging them down. The reef rises under the boats like a hard stop. Higgins boats behind the LVTs slam into it and grind to a halt. The water is too shallow and the tide isn't rising. The plan is already breaking apart. Hundreds of Marines now face the same choice: stay with the stuck boats and be slaughtered, or step into chest-deep water and wade hundreds of yards toward machine guns already zeroed in on them. Most don't hesitate, they jump. It becomes a slow-motion nightmare. The water churns with impacts. Rounds snap past their ears. Men disappear beneath the surface and don't come up. The current pulls them sideways, closer to the reef, closer to the bodies starting to drift. The pressure keeps climbing. Every yard forward costs a life. Mid-morning, the first wave reaches the beach, or what's left of it. The seawall is splintered. Sandbags are shredded. Smoke rolls sideways across the ground like crawling fog. The Marines have made it to cover, but they're pinned flat, pressed against the low wall, unable to move. The second wave is still out in the water, taking fire that never stops. Reports ripple down the line. LVTs destroyed. Boats stuck on the reef. Radio drowned. Casualties heavy. Officers try to reorganize, but the confusion is total. Units mix, break, reform. Squad leaders drag whoever is still alive into makeshift clusters. No one can hear orders over the Japanese guns firing from bunkers carved into coral. And then comes the twist everyone feared. The Japanese artillery, silent all morning, finally opens fire. Shells hit the lagoon. The shock waves punch into the Marines wading in. Whole lines collapse. For a few minutes, it looks like the assault might fail right there in the water. But the third wave, those in the last functioning LVTs, pushes through the chaos and crawls over the seawall, ripping open a small pocket of ground behind the beach. It's not much, but it's enough for someone to stand, look around, and finally see what the battle truly is. Not an assault, a knife fight on a sandbar. At 10:30 a.m., a group of Marines spot a break in the enemy fire pattern, a narrow angle in the interlocking fields of fire. They sprint through it, ducking behind wreckage and rubble, and begin clearing bunkers one at a time with grenades and rifle fire. Every bunker they take widens the foothold. Every destroyed pillbox weakens the defense that was supposed to be unbreakable. The decisive turn isn't a single moment. It's a series of tiny, furious victories measured in feet. By early afternoon, a path inland opens, still narrow, still lethal, but real. Those first 60 yards of beach become a world unto themselves. The air is so thick with smoke that shapes blur into silhouettes. The ground shakes constantly, sometimes from American shells, sometimes from Japanese counterfire. Marines huddle in craters so small they can't lie flat. The sand is hot enough to burn skin. Reports describe Marines fighting in conditions where they couldn't tell if a bunker was 10 yards away or 50, where machine gun fire cut patterns into the sand like sewing needles, where men fired at shadows because waiting to confirm a target usually meant dying. The bodies pile up against the seawall. Some are men who drowned trying to reach the shore. Some are those who were pulled down by their own gear. Some are those who ran the last 10 yards and didn't make it. And yet, through the chaos, the line keeps inching forward. A flamethrower team burns through a cluster of defenders holding the center line. Engineers blast open concrete casemates with demolition charges. Riflemen crawl, sprint, collapse, and rise again, advancing between shattered palm trees and burning debris. Inside the bunkers, Japanese soldiers fight with a ferocity fueled by a philosophy that forbids surrender. Even wounded defenders hold their posts to the last. Every one of them forces the Marines to pay in blood for each advance. The emotional toll builds. Exhaustion, shock, a creeping sense that the island is consuming everything they brought with them. No one knows what hour it is anymore, just that they're still alive and still moving. By the time the sun dips toward the horizon, the beachhead is no longer collapsing. It's expanding. Marines push across the airstrip, clearing the island in jagged steps. The Japanese still hold strong points, massive concrete positions that take hours to reduce. But the momentum has shifted. The defenders who swore the island was impregnable are beginning to understand the truth. The Americans aren't stopping. They're bleeding, but they're not stopping. And the Marines realize something too, something that settles heavily into everyone who survived the landing. This was the cost of learning how to take a fortified island. This was the future of the Pacific. The smoke thins just enough for the horizon to show. The tide begins to fall again, revealing the reef, and the long trail of bodies still floating near it. And then everything changed. When the shooting finally dies down, the scale of what happened becomes unavoidable. Tarawa is barely a mile long, yet it holds more destruction per square foot than almost any battle the Marines had fought before. What's left of the Japanese garrison lies in ruined bunkers and collapsed trenches, nearly all killed, just as their commanders intended. For the Americans, victory feels different. It's real, but it's heavy, hard-earned. Nothing about it looks clean. Strategically, Tarawa forces a reckoning. The Marine Corps now has proof of what the Central Pacific Campaign will demand. Not quick amphibious landings against disorganized defenses, but brutal, systematic fights against fortresses built for annihilation. The lesson is stark. If an island this small can cost so much, what happens when they hit larger ones, with higher terrain, with deeper garrisons, with months of preparation. Commanders studying the battle's reports begin rewriting invasion doctrine almost immediately. New landing craft, better intelligence, stronger pre-landing fire, specialized teams for bunker clearing. Tarawa becomes the blueprint, its mistakes turned into pages of instruction that will shape the next 2 years of war. For Japan, the aftermath carries a different message. Their defensive model worked exactly as designed. Inflict the highest possible casualties, force hesitation, and hope America pauses long enough for Japan to reinforce the next line of islands. But what they misjudge is resolve. Tarawa doesn't deter the United States. It ignites something harder, more focused. The factories rolling on Friday's episode are the proof. America is about to industrialize the solution to Tarawa. At home, newsreels showing the cost of the battle shock the public. This is one of the first times Americans truly see what the Pacific War looks like at ground level. There is no romance in the footage, just mud, fire, exhaustion, and sacrifice compressed into 72 hours. And for the Marines who survived, the island never really leaves them. The sound of the reef, the feeling of sinking into water heavy with debris, the memory of that first sprint toward the seawall. Those details become part of the story they carry long after the island is secure. Tarawa is in American hands, but the cost echoes. If you love real World War II stories that sound unbelievable but actually happened, subscribe for more. What happened next on this tiny island reveals something even deeper, something most history books barely mention. Tarawa wasn't just a bloody lesson in amphibious warfare. It exposed a blind spot that no American commander fully appreciated until the battle was over. The Japanese hadn't simply fortified an island. They had engineered a defense built around predicting American assumptions, tide charts, landing craft capabilities, the timing of naval bombardment, even how Marines were likely to cluster under fire. Shibasaki's entire plan hinged on one idea: force the enemy into the water, not onto the beach. That coral reef, the one intelligence officers debated for weeks, became the silent killer of the first day. It froze landing craft exactly where the Japanese wanted them, hundreds of yards offshore, under direct fire, with no room for maneuver. But the deeper irony goes even further. Shibasaki believed his garrison could hold for 1,000 years. In truth, they held for 76 hours. Why? Because the same reef that trapped the Marines also trapped the Japanese. Their heavy guns, buried deep in concrete, couldn't be moved. Their fields of fire were perfect, until the moment Marines breached just one angle, one bunker, one slice of the seawall. After that, the defense couldn't adapt. Their fortress was built to destroy, not to flex. And this is the quiet revelation. Tarawa didn't teach America how strong Japan was. It taught America where Japan couldn't bend. That understanding, more than any weapon, shaped the rest of the Pacific War. In the end, the battle doesn't fade, it lingers. The reef, the smoke, the 40 yards of open water, they stay with the men who crossed them. When our Marine finally steps back toward the shoreline, he sees the island for what it really is. Not just a victory, but a warning stitched into the sand. The Pacific still has larger islands, higher cliffs, deeper fortifications waiting ahead. And he knows this. What he lived through on Tarawa is only the beginning. Because what he saw in those final minutes on Tarawa wasn't the end. It was the warning of what the Pacific still had in store. Next time, we follow that warning to the factories where America builds the answer.